Department of Homeland Security says time's up for some 200,000 El Salvadorans who have been in this country under a temporary protected status for years. And here to explain more of what's at stake is Matthew Sorens, U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Heather.
Matt, tell us about this particular group of people. How long have they been here, and what does it look like is going to happen to them now?
So these particular individuals, and there's estimates are somewhere around 200,000 individuals, have all been in lawful status since at least 2001. And some of them were here, all of them were here before that, either on a temporary visa or unlawfully. But so we know they've all been here at least since 2001, so about 17 years. And what will happen now, as temporary protected status has been withdrawn or is being withdrawn in the coming months, is they will be legally they will lose their work authorization, and they will be expected to either voluntarily return or they'll be at risk of deportation.
So really in limbo. You mentioned on Twitter that a lot of these Salvadorans are Christians. What do we know about their faith?
Yeah, well, if you look geographically, El Salvador is actually one of the most Christian countries in Latin America, particularly evangelical Christian. So Salvadorans are disproportionately represented in Spanish-speaking churches in the United States. So, I go to a Spanish-speaking church, and there are Spanish-speaking churches throughout the United States that have really been blessed by people from El Salvador. And unfortunately, many of those people have been able to be here lawfully because of temporary protected status. They have raised their families here with that status. And as this goes away, they are being expected to make really difficult decisions of departing or staying unlawfully in the country, or maybe the parents depart, but the children, because most of these people have had kids born in the U.S. in the last 17 or more years. Maybe the kids stay here with relatives, or even in foster care, while the parents return to El Salvador. So they're really difficult situations for families. And
it sounds like another concern, of course, is that El Salvador is at such a violent place in its history right now. So if they go back, they're facing a whole set of issues there.
Absolutely. I was in El Salvador back in May, and every church that I visited had stories of the violence that's affecting El Salvador right now, driven by gangs. And the sad reality is young people are actually in some of the most risk of being either recruited into a gang, or if they refuse, being threatened with violence. That's where I'm particularly concerned about these children, roughly 190,000 U.S. citizen kids who, if they go back with their parents, the kids won't be going back because they've never been to El Salvador, but if they go with their parents to El Salvador, they could be uniquely threatened by these gangs, and the risk of violence is very significant. El Salvador has had the #1 homicide rate in the world in the last several years.
So, Matt, at this point, what would you like to see happen given this move by the Department of Homeland Security?
Yeah, I'm personally sympathetic to the critique that this temporary protected status, which is what TPS stands for, hasn't been very temporary. So I understand that it doesn't necessarily make sense to continually renew something that was supposed to be temporary. But at the point that our government has allowed people to be here for almost 2 decades, they've gone through background checks every year and a half. They haven't qualified for federal means-tested public benefits, so they've been working. The vast majority are employed. I think it would make sense for Congress to pass legislation that would allow these people to apply for permanent legal status and eventually to earn citizenship. I think a lot of Americans probably don't realize it, as I didn't realize until I worked in immigration law, that under the current law, they don't qualify. There's no way for the majority of these people to go and sign up for a green card. But Congress could make that path possible for people who have been in this unique status of having been here for so long, having been well integrated into communities, into churches, whose families are settled here. And that's my hope, is that Congress will come together, and there already are bipartisan bills towards that end, and allow people whose temporary protected status has really gone beyond being temporary to become permanent residents of the United States.
A lot of hopes resting on Congress right now, and I want to ask you about another group of immigrants, and that is dreamers, children whose parents brought them here illegally. Congress is in negotiations right now talking about that group of immigrants and what's going to happen with the dreamers. What do you know? What's the latest on that?
Well, I know what we've been reading in the news, which is that there are negotiations. I think there's a lot of good faith negotiations on both sides of the aisle on this. I really am hoping and praying, because this affects so many young people who I know personally, again, who are also part of local churches in so many cases, that Congress can come together and find an agreement that says, look, these are people who didn't make the choice to come here. They were brought here as kids. They've done everything our government has asked of them. In the last several years, they've come forward. They've paid fees. They've gone through background checks. And now they're working. They're in school in many cases. Let's allow them then to contribute, to continue working, to continue paying taxes. Because already there are people every day losing their status because they missed the deadline to file to renew DACA. And starting in March, that number will go from about 100 per day to about 1,000 per day. And employers will be required to lay those people off. They will be at risk of deportation. It's a very serious situation, and I'm hoping and praying that Congress can come together, find a deal. There could be ways to improve our border security in the midst of this as well. I think we're open to that. But for me, the most urgent situation is these young people. I have colleagues who are affected by this who World Relief would have to lay off if the Congress doesn't find a solution. So it's a very urgent situation.
Well, Matt, what's your take on the bottleneck? Because it does seem that there has been support for the Dreamers on both sides of the aisle. Granted, not everyone, but what is really holding things up, do you think?
Yeah, I think if there was a vote on something like the DREAM Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation that's been introduced over and over again since 2001, it hasn't passed in all those years. But I think if there was a straight up and down vote today in both houses of Congress, I think that bill would very likely pass. I think the challenge is that members of Congress are looking for some clarity from the administration on what exactly they would like to see in a deal, because there's been maybe some mixed messages there. I think most people in Congress on both sides of the aisle are open to some significant improvements to border security. I think that's a goal that most Americans share. But I also think that this isn't the time to try to fix everything that's wrong with our immigration system, because that is such a complex process that it shouldn't be rushed through. I think we need a comprehensive immigration reform. But the situation of Dreamers, because it's so urgent, really needs to be resolved quickly.
All right. Well, a lot of lives are at stake, of course, as these negotiations are taking place. We'll continue to watch. Matt Sorens with World Relief, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather.